Colossians chapter 3, listen to this. Servants. And he's not talking about like people who just work for somebody, though it should be applied to it. He's talking about slaves. They had slaves back then. In the Old Testament they had slaves. In the New Testament they had slaves. You know, God never said that slavery, I know you're probably going, what? God never said slavery is wrong. He said, masters, be good to your slaves. It's just that we think of slaves, and the first thing we think of is we went over and kidnapped a bunch of people from Africa and took them over to here. That was our problem. We blew it. We blew it. We kidnapped them. And it was forced, hard forced labor. And God says, you should see it, man. God says, masters, treat your slaves with goodness and kindness and love. So he says here, so just in case you're wondering, servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service. Man, isn't that the truth? So often as working in a job, you know, I remember I would think to myself, gosh, if I can just perform well in front of the boss, and then when the boss is away, relax. He says this, not with eye service as men pleasers. You know what that's telling you? If you only perform well in front of your boss when he's watching, that's proof that you're a man pleaser. Now, who wants to be called a man pleaser? He says here, but in singleness of heart, with one goal, one motive, fearing God, and whatever you do, do it with all your heart as unto the Lord, not unto men. I've told the story before, you know, of Charles Spurgeon, where he was speaking and a preacher was in the audience, a preacher from another congregation. And Spurgeon loved to enjoy his pipe. He was a smoker. He smoked a pipe. Now granted, this is before we have all the evidence that we have for, you know, the dangers of smoking, but here's a guy who was smoking his pipe. And there was a time in London where it went, in London, England, where it went from like, oh, I don't know, 350 pounds of cigars that were smoked on a yearly basis or something like that, to 250,000 pounds. And this was in a time span of about a year. And so this guy, and so here's this preacher, and Charles Spurgeon invites him up to preach. And so the guy gets up there and talks about the evils of smoking a pipe. And Spurgeon gets up in his seat. Charles Spurgeon, he's a Baptist. A Baptist. And he gets up in his seat and he says, I will smoke my pipe to the glory of God. I know that's probably offensive. That's probably offensive to some of you. Now, I don't smoke just because I've seen enough in the research that teaches that it does a lot of damage to your lungs. It'll give you lung cancer. Okay? But man, meat can give you colon cancer if you eat enough of it. I always laugh at these people who try to pinpoint smokers, pinpoint drinkers. I'm like, well, wait a minute. You're saying, okay, it damages the temple. Well, what about meat? There are a lot of people that eat a lot of red meat. I'm one of them. But sometimes we got to moderate it. We don't want to just eat a bunch of big old filet mignons. If that's all you do for your life, well, yeah, you might get colon cancer. These are important things to think about. Whatever you do, do it with all your heart unto God. I don't care what it is. If you're a person that believes you can have a couple of glasses of wine with your dinner, drink your wine to the glory of God. But if you doubt it in your conscience and you're struggling, Romans 14 says don't do it. But don't impose your burden, your individual conscience burden, on someone else, is what Romans 14 is saying. We have to do it with our whole heart to the glory of God. Now, could I go out there and open up a pack of Camel for me and smoke it to the glory of God? No, I can't, but someone else might. Someone who's more mature than I am might be able to do that. That's what he says. You look in Romans chapter 14. He says there's one man who is a weaker brother who believes he can only eat vegetables. But then there's another man who believes that he can eat all things. He says whatever you do, do it with faith, doubting nothing. And I think too, so many people are caught up in trying to impose their conscience on someone else. And Paul says don't do that. But he says very clearly, don't use your liberty to cause someone else to what? Stumble. That's where we have to be careful. So whatever you do it with all your heart to the glory of God. And if there's a possibility of maybe causing someone to stumble, hey, don't mess with it. Listen to this, the fourth one. Think on God. Seen, focus on today. Do not be anxious. Do all things with your whole heart and for God. Now just think about God. Think about Him. Listen to this. Psalm 63. My soul shall be satisfied. You ask, am I satisfied? Am I content? My soul shall be satisfied as with marrow and fatness. And my mouth shall praise you with joyful lips. Watch. When I remember you on my bed and think of you in the night watches. Because you have been my help. Therefore, in the shadow of your wings, I will rejoice. My soul follows hard after you. Your right hand upholds me. And then lastly, probably most importantly, love one another. Focus on today. Don't be anxious. Do all things with your whole heart and for God. Think on God and love one another. And watch what Jesus does. In this is my Father glorified, John 15, verse 8 through 12, that you bear much fruit, so shall you be my disciples. Now watch what the fruit is. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Continue in my love. If you keep my commandments, what are His commandments? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you keep my commandments, you shall abide in my love. Even as I have kept my commandments, Father's commandments, and abide in His love. I have spoken these things to you so that my joy might remain in you and your joy would be what? Full. How do you get fullness of joy? Love one another. That's it. Some people wonder, why is my life so miserable? Remember that joke I told you about the person on their porch barking at people all the time? Remember that? What, and you know, you see this a lot. You see this a lot. You see it in the young and the old. And a lot of times the young people like to pick on the old. Oh, here's an old, geezer, and he's just always angry and bitter. Well, a lot of times that happens, but it doesn't happen to just the old. But a lot of times it happens to the old because they're looking back and they have never displayed love. They have never shown love and forgiveness. They've been too busy picking apart people, and so their lives are miserable at the end of life. What a horrible way to die. And look back on your life and say, I haven't loved. I haven't forgiven. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. And I'll finish with this last verse. Isaiah 26, verse 3. You will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you, whose mind is focused on you. So if you're wondering how to have a content, satisfied, non-anxious mind, and believe me, I was doing this sermon, putting together this sermon, and I'm sitting there going, ouch, ouch, I got to preach this. And I struggle with it so much myself. So don't think that I'm just preaching this to you. No message, man. Every time I preach a message, it's always like first just gouged me in the heart. But this is the truth. This is the truth. Regardless of whether I sometimes battle with it, which I'm going to. And there are going to be times when you see me battling with anxiety. And it's during those times, let me quote you a verse I once heard quoted, oh, it's by you. Throw a verse back at me. Remind me, comfort me when you see me going through anxiety. Okay? And we'll do that to each other. Just remind us. Stir each other up. Do it with your whole heart as unto God. Do everything with all your might and with all your heart as unto God. I don't care what it is. Just make sure you're doing it unto God. If you can't do it with your whole heart unto God, don't do it. Don't do it. Let's pray. Our Father, we thank you.